Welcome back to English with Jonny, a place where you can learn how to speak good, proper, authentic English. Today is a rather special episode because we're not only going to be doing part 2 of the speaking test, we will also be doing the subsequent part 3 questions which follow on from the topic in part 2. So today's cue card is to describe an experience when you travelled by public transport. So you need to say where you were going, what mode of transportation you were using, who you were with, and how you felt about the trip. Well, a particularly memorable trip for me when taking public transport was when I had first come to the country. So I was pretty new to Vietnam, and it was my first time taking a bus. I had just become a teacher, so I was on my way to a fairly out-of-the-way school. So I was stood at the bus stop with my arms stuck out, waiting for the bus. There wasn't any timetable or anything, so I wasn't quite sure how long I would have to wait for, and I did end up waiting quite a bit before the bus finally arrived. When the bus did arrive, it came speeding down the road. It was clearly exceeding any legal speed limits. Not that I could see any signs or anything. Anyway, when it did finally stop, the doors flung open and one of the people managing the bus literally grabbed me and threw me onto the bus. I was obviously pretty dazed and shocked at this, and it took me a while to take in my surroundings. But when I did, I realised that it was pretty packed and the seating was all rather makeshift. So I made do with a sort of mattress on the floor located to the front of the bus. Unfortunately, I didn't have any friends with me at this time because all of my colleagues had already been sent to other schools or had their own form of transport. So I was on my own. I think if I had had a few mates with me, it would have been a bit of a laugh, but I wasn't so lucky. Anyway, the trip itself was extremely eventful. I mean, you could feel each and every pothole on the road, and it's not an exaggeration to say it was a bumpy ride. So I was particularly anxious and terrified. However, after doing this journey for a few days, I became pretty nonchalant towards the whole thing. With part 2 out of the way, it's time to move on to part 3. Well, I believe the main reason that air travel has become increasingly accessible these days is in large part due to globalization. Countries all across the world nowadays are trying to build and cultivate relationships with one another, and in order to do this effectively, they need a convenient form of transport. And I believe that planes fit the bill perfectly here. In terms of consumers, in the past, travelling by plane was an incredibly expensive luxury that only a few could afford. But nowadays it's a very competitive industry, and as a result there's so many packages and deals online, and there's lots of bargains to be had, and people will often be able to get the best value for their money when travelling by plane, which has made it an incredibly attractive option. Well, in Vietnam there are 3 main forms of public transportation. These are bus, taxi and plane. Bus is obviously the cheapest of these and also the most unreliable, which is reflected in its pricing. Taxis are a tad more expensive, but miles more convenient. In terms of planes, international flights are pretty expensive, but if you're travelling domestically, there's lots of deals to be had and packages, which makes it quite affordable for the average person. So all in all, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think the biggest issue when taking public transport in Vietnam is due to the lack of reliability. Most of the infrastructure here is outdated. What I mean by that is most of the cars and the buses and the planes are old and falling to bits because they've not been properly maintained. This means that they will often encounter breakdowns and problems on the journey, which really inconveniences the people taking these modes of transport. Another thing is the public aspect of public transport. You can't choose who's going to be on the vehicle with you. You could be sitting next to someone quite unsavoury who makes the journey very unpleasant, and you can't do anything about it because you have to share, because it's public. I think the last thing is the lack of timetabling. The timetables here aren't very rigid and fixed, and most of the vehicles don't, follow them. However, the exception to this is planes. Often when you get a plane in Vietnam, it's quite accurate, but regarding buses and trains, I wouldn't count on them at all. So guys, I hope you managed to pick up lots of new vocabulary and feel a bit more confident in tackling both these parts of the test, because they are much more difficult than part 1. But if you keep watching these videos and you keep learning something from them, then I'm sure you will be able to handle them just fine. Until next time.